imagine stepping into the cold, dark void of an abandoned church, a place once sacred, now reeking of decay and despair. The air is thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten prayers. Shadows stretch across the cracked stone floor, and the faint echo of distant whispers seems to hang in the air, though no one else is there. Now, picture this. A group of friends, eager to explore the unknown, bring a Ouija board into this forsaken place. They thought it was just a game. But what happened next? One of them hasn't spoken a word since that night. The allure of the unknown has always fascinated us, hasn't it? There's something irresistible about stepping into a place with a dark history, a place where the veil between this world and the next seems thinner. The abandoned church was exactly that kind of place. It was said to have been deserted for decades, after a tragic fire claimed the lives of several parishioners during a midnight mass. Some say the fire was no accident, that something far more sinister was at play. But the records are sparse, and the truth has been buried along with the victims. The church stood on the outskirts of town, hidden among twisted trees and overgrown weeds. Its once grand steeple now leaning as if in prayer for mercy. The windows were shattered, the doors hanging on rusted hinges, and inside, the pews were scattered, blackened by soot, and covered in layers of dust and grime. For most, the place was a nightmare come to life, but for us, it was the perfect spot for a little thrill. We had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. People spoke of strange lights at night, of voices calling out from the empty nave, and of figures moving in the shadows. But no one ever dared to get too close, except us. We thought we were braver than the rest, or maybe just more foolish. We were drawn to the church like moths to a flame, and when someone suggested we bring a Ouija board, it seemed like the perfect way to test our courage. I still remember the look on Sarah's face when she pulled the board out of her backpack, her eyes gleaming with excitement and just a hint of fear. We had all heard stories about Ouija boards, how they could open doors to the other side, how they could summon spirits, and how dangerous they could be if not used properly. But we didn't believe any of that. We were young, reckless, and looking for a good scare. The night we chose was a moonless one, the sky a blanket of pitch black, with only the stars to guide us. As we made our way to the church, the only sounds were the crunch of dead leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. The air grew colder the closer we got, and by the time we reached the church, our breaths were visible in the frigid air. Inside, the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the creaking of the old wooden beams above us. We set up in the middle of the nave, right where the altar used to stand. The Ouija board, with its letters, numbers, and the word goodbye at the bottom, was placed on an old, dusty cloth. We sat in a circle around it, our flashlights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. At first, it was just a bit of fun. We laughed nervously as we placed our fingers on the planchette, feeling the smooth wood under our fingertips. Sarah, who had always been the boldest among us, was the one to ask the first question. Is there anyone here with us? For a long moment, nothing happened. The planchette sat motionless on the board, and we exchanged uneasy glances. But then slowly, it began to move. At first, we thought it was Sarah, or maybe Jake, who was always playing pranks. But the way it moved, the The way it glided across the board, none of us were prepared for that. It was like something was guiding it. The planchette slid over to yes, and that was when the mood shifted. The laughter died, replaced by a heavy silence. We asked another question. Who are you? And the planchette began to spell out a name. Mikael. At that moment, a gust of wind blew through the church. Even though there were no open windows or doors, the candles we had lit flickered wildly. And I swear I heard a faint whisper, like someone was breathing right next to my ear. We should have stopped then. We should have packed up the board and left, but we didn't. Sarah, her voice trembling now, asked, "What do you want?" The planchette didn't move for what felt like an eternity. And then, in a swift, deliberate motion, it spelled out one word: you. A chill ran down my spine, and I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. But still, we stayed. It was as if we were rooted to the spot, unable to break free from the spell that had been cast over us. As the night wore on, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The temperature dropped even further, our breath forming thick clouds in the air, and the sounds around us became more distinct. Soft, almost imperceptible footsteps echoing in the distance, the faint sound of chanting, and every now and then, the creak of wood, as if someone was moving just out of sight. We asked more questions, but the answers became increasingly nonsensical, or perhaps deliberately vague. At one point, the planchette started moving erratically, spelling out words that didn't make any sense, and that's when the real terror began. Jake suddenly stood up, his eyes wide with fear, and started backing away from the board. "I'm done with this," he said, his voice shaking. "This isn't funny anymore." But before he could turn to leave, the heavy wooden door of the church slammed shut with a deafening bang. We all jumped, our hearts pounding in our chests. Jake rushed to the door and tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it closed. That's when we noticed that the planchette was still moving, even though none of us were touching it. It was moving faster now, almost frantically, and it kept spelling out the same word over and over: run. We didn't need to be told twice. We abandoned the board and ran to the door, frantically trying to force it open. When it finally gave way, we spilled out into the night, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the church, until the ominous structure was just a distant shadow on the horizon. But the terror didn't end there. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Sarah, who had been the one to initiate the session, was the first to experience it. She started hearing whispers at night, soft voices that seemed to come from the walls of her bedroom. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but they filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. Then came the nightmares. Dark, twisted visions of the church, of the board, of something unspeakable waiting in the shadows. It wasn't just Sarah. Jake started seeing things out of the corner of his eye, shadowy figures that would disappear as soon as he turned to look. He became paranoid, refusing to leave his house, convinced that something was following him. And then, one night, he disappeared. We found his car abandoned on the side of the road, the driver's door hanging open, but there was no sign of Jake. The police searched for weeks, but they never found him. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The rest of us were not spared either. Strange accidents, bad luck, and a pervasive sense of unease plagued us. was as if a dark cloud had settled over our lives, one that we couldn't escape. We tried to talk about it, to make sense of what had happened. But the more we talked, the more we realized that whatever we had encountered in that church was far beyond our understanding. I remember the night it all came to a head. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it. The same whispering that Sarah had described. It was so faint, so soft, but it was there. I sat up, my heart pounding, and that's when I saw it. Standing at the foot of my bed was a figure, tall and dark, with eyes that seemed to glow with an unnatural light. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. I was frozen with fear, unable to scream, unable to move. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. But the terror it left behind was very real. That was the night I decided to leave town, to get as far away from that church as possible. I thought I could escape it, leave behind the terror that had consumed my life. For a while, it seemed to work. I moved to a new city, changed my phone number, and cut off contact with everyone who had been there that night. I even started to believe that maybe it was all in my head, that the distance would be enough to protect me from whatever we had unleashed. But then, it started again. It was subtle at first, a faint whisper in the dead of night, a shadow flickering at the edge of my vision. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had followed us from that church wasn't done with me yet. The nightmares returned, more vivid and horrifying than before. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing, convinced that something was watching me from the darkness. My apartment, once a place of refuge, became a prison. The air was thick with an invisible menace, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable chill every night. One night, the terror escalated. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, too afraid to close my eyes, when I felt something cold brush against my arm. I bolted upright, but there was nothing there. Just the darkness, pressing in on all sides. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere in the room. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was right beside me, even though I couldn't see it. Panic set in, and I scrambled out of bed, knocking over a lamp in my haste. As I backed into the corner, the shadows seemed to grow thicker, almost tangible, as if they were closing in on me. I knew then that I couldn't outrun it. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to let me go. I needed help, but who could I turn to? I had distanced myself from everyone, convinced that leaving was the only way to protect them. But there was one person I hadn't considered, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Desperate and terrified, I reached for my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used since college. Father O'Malley, a priest who had once been a family friend and who had a reputation for dealing with unusual cases. When he answered, I could barely get the words out, but he listened, his voice calm and reassuring, even as I told him everything. He didn't question me, didn't doubt my story. Instead, he simply said, "I'll be there as soon as I can. Don't let it in. Whatever you do, don't let it in." True to his word, Father O'Malley arrived the next day, his presence bringing with it a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. He was older now, his hair grayer, but there was a strength in his eyes that made me believe he could help. He wasted no time, setting up a small altar in my living room, placing candles, holy water, and a crucifix in the center. As he worked, he explained that what we had encountered in that church was not just a spirit, but something far more malevolent, something that had latched onto us the moment we opened that door. "It's not just after you," he said, his voice grave. "It's after your soul." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach, but Father O'Malley didn't give me time to dwell on it. He began a series of prayers, his voice firm and commanding, filling the room with a sense of purpose. As he prayed, the air around us seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. But then, the shadows began to move. They twisted and writhed, coalescing into a shape. A tall, dark figure with glowing eyes, just like the one I had seen that night. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, but Father O'Malley stepped forward, holding the crucifix high. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave this place," he shouted, his voice echoing through the apartment. The figure recoiled, letting out a hideous screech that made my blood run cold. But it didn't disappear. Instead, it lunged at Father O'Malley, knocking him to the ground. I watched in horror as he struggled against the unseen force, his face contorted with pain. In that moment, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just stand by and watch him be consumed by the very thing he had come to save me from. My eyes fell on the holy water by the altar, and without thinking, I grabbed the bottle and splashed it over the figure. It let out another ear-piercing scream, and for a brief moment, the darkness seemed to flicker, as if losing its hold. Seizing the opportunity, Father O'Malley pushed himself to his feet and resumed his prayers, this time with renewed vigor. The figure thrashed and writhed, the shadows around it dissipating like smoke in the wind. Finally, with one last, agonized shriek, it vanished, leaving behind an overwhelming silence. The oppressive chill in the room lifted, replaced by a warmth that felt like the sun breaking through a storm. Father O'Malley, breathing heavily, turned to me with a weary smile. "It's over," he said, though I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "But you must never forget, some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed." I nodded, too shaken to speak. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the realization of how close I had come to losing everything. Father O'Malley stayed with me for a few more hours, ensuring that the apartment was cleansed and that whatever had haunted me was truly gone. Before he left, he handed me a small silver crucifix. "Keep this with you," he said. "It's a reminder of the light in the darkness. And if you ever need help again, don't hesitate to call." Months have passed since that night, and while the fear has subsided, the memory of what happened will stay with me forever. I still keep the crucifix close, a symbol of the battle I fought and won against the darkness. I've learned that some things are beyond our understanding, that the unknown is not always something to be trifled with. And most importantly, I've learned that even in our darkest moments, help can come from the most unexpected places. If you've ever had an experience like this, or if you have a story to share, I encourage you to leave it in the comments below. Your story might help someone who is going through the same thing. And if this tale kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. Stay vigilant, stay safe, and remember, there are forces out there we may never fully comprehend, but we are never truly alone.